Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we are pleased to welcome Emma Marris to the podcast. Emma is the author of Wild Souls, What We Owe Animals in a Changing World, and the winner of the Rachel Carson Environment Book Award. Emma Marris has been writing about the environment, science, and philosophy for over 20 years, starting as a staff writer for Nature magazine, then writing for National Geographic, Wired, The Atlantic, and the New York Times. Her first book, Rambunctious Garden, focuses on the relationship between nature and how humans have changed the landscape since prehistory, and how climate change means that the remotest places bear the footprints of humanity, and argues it's time to look forward and create the rambunctious garden, a hybrid of wild nature and human management. In Wild Souls, Emma focuses on the space between animal welfare and conservation science, where there exists an unexamined and unresolved tension, wildness itself. Emma transports the reader into the world of animals, where scientists are tackling profound challenges. Emma offers a tour of the philosophical ideas that may steer our search for sustainability and justice in the non-human world. Wild Souls makes us look at the way we think about nature and our place in it. Emma joins me from her home in Portland, Oregon, to talk about what we owe animals in this changing world. Emma, welcome to Nature Revisited.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure having you on the podcast, talking with me today about your latest book, Wild Souls. So let's start at the beginning of the book, where you say that Wild Souls is a journey. What was it that started you on that journey?
I'm a journalist, and I've been covering ecology and conservation for 20 years or so. So I've learned a lot about those fields. In those fields, animals are treated essentially as units of a population. The goal is really to stop extinctions or to save particular populations. Individual animals and their sort of cognition or sentience or their desires are not really taken into account. And in fact, I had been covering some conservation approaches that had focused actually on removing non-native animals that were causing population declines in native species. This is a pretty common dynamic on islands. And increasingly, there's been more and more ambitious campaigns to remove things like goats, rats, foxes, cats, where they're causing what are seen as undesirable effects. And by remove, I mean kill. These animals are being poisoned, shot, trapped. I thought to myself, there's a tension here between saving species and what we might call animal welfare or animal rights. It's always interesting to me when people who are trying to do the right thing come into conflict. More interesting than climate activists versus evil oil companies for me, because the oil companies seem like the bad guys. It seems pretty straightforward. Whereas in this case, the people who were killing the animals seemed like they were trying to stop extinctions. I thought this was just a really interesting tension, and it led me down this long journey of trying to reconcile the ethics of environmental thought with the ethics of animal lives. And those two things turn out to be really tough to reconcile.
Why was philosophy the first stop on your journey? And how has philosophers shaped and continue to shape our relationships with animals?
I started out as a science reporter, and I still think of myself as a science writer. But these are ultimately not scientific questions. When you move from describing the world or predicting the outcomes of actions to having conversations about what you should do or what you ought to do or what you shouldn't do, now you're in this realm of ethics, which science can't really help you out with. You need philosophy. So I dived into philosophy, and at first I was a little bit nervous, but as a science reporter, I was actually kind of used to decoding jargon and figuring out what people were talking about. And it turns out that philosophy is not as scary as I thought it was. It's really just about the sort of puzzles of trying to figure out how to act in the world and what the right courses of action are. Some people care more about what are the outcomes of these different actions. Other approaches are much more looking at just sort of the actions themselves. For example, can we say it's never okay to kill a sentient creature? Is that a strict rule? Although environmental ethics is a much younger discipline, it's also quite rich, and there's lots of different ideas about what is valuable in the natural world. What are we trying to protect or save when we try to stop extinctions? What's the value there? And in some ways, it's a trickier proposition. You know, you can look an animal in the eyes and you can see that it would be bad to hurt this animal for no good reason. Whereas a species is a kind of an abstract collection of individual animals. And the idea that a species should exist rather than not exist is a little more of an abstract proposition. Although I admit that and I think many people, do feel really strongly that extinctions are bad things and that we should avoid extinctions. So what do you do when the only way to avoid an extinction is to kill a bunch of animals?
So what really separates wild from domestic when it comes to people's perception of animals, such as wolf versus dog?
This was a question that I got really interested in when I was covering wolves a lot in Oregon. Wolves and dogs are biologically the same species, using a biological species concept. By that I mean they can mate and they can have babies, and those babies will be fertile. They're perfectly happy to hybridize willy-nilly and have all sorts of pups. And yet there's this irony because we see dogs as perhaps the most intimately human animal. They're not just domestic animals like a chicken or a donkey. They are our family. They live in our houses. They sleep in our beds. And then wolves are sort of the icon of wilderness. You know, if we want to draw a picture symbolizing wildness, we might draw a howling wolf. We see them as the wildest of the wild, and yet they're the same animal. So this is a really interesting puzzle to me, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how it plays out when wolves and dogs do hybridize and how that helps us get at what we mean when we say that an animal is wild. To get at the specifics of what are we saying when we say wild animal is something I really wanted to dig into.
What is the virgin wilderness narrative? And how has that hindered us from having a positive and mutually beneficial relationship with other species?
Well, just as the distinction between the dog and the wolf is obviously something that we humans are kind of creating and maintaining, I think the same is really true of landscapes. This idea that some landscapes are wilderness and some landscapes are not is not something you can necessarily measure scientifically with like some kind of wilderness meter, because it's all about the history of a place, to what extent humans have influenced that place. In my earlier book, Rambunctious Garden, I started this deconstruction of wilderness, and I continue it in Wild Souls. And at this point, I don't think that the word wilderness is helpful. When Europeans first arrived in North and South America, in Australia, New Zealand, the landscapes that they saw there were not uninfluenced by people. Perception that these were somehow virgin wildernesses was very much rooted in colonialist thinking about low agency of the people who lived there. These are racist ideas, let's be clear. This idea that some places are uninfluenced by humans didn't make sense in the first place. And of course, now we have layered on top of that influences like climate change, which are global in nature. There is no place on the planet that is not affected by climate change. We don't have places that are uninfluenced by humans, nor should we necessarily focus on that as our gold standard for what we want to protect in nature or in the non-human world, because humans are an animal that is part of nature. And these interactions are not by definition always negative. I think this is a huge shift that's taking place in our culture, at least in the cultures of environmentalism, is that people are really beginning to see that there can be good relationships between humans and non-humans, and those can be mutually beneficial relationships. Those kinds of relationships are not necessarily bad just because we are humans and humans are always bad. I think getting away from this human exceptionalism is very important. We're not animals. We are not ecological. We are completely embedded in ecosystems around the world. I think wilderness as a concept is no longer useful, or I don't think it ever made much sense. On the other hand, describing animals as wild, I think can be useful, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
So what is some of the baggage or misrepresentation that the word nature sometimes carries with it?
You just heard me use the word nature and then kind of backtrack and say the non-human world. And this is part of an ongoing effort in my own life to not use the word nature. Wilderness, we can just retire wilderness. Nature itself, I think, is tricky because it's so embedded in the way we think that even though I have tried to get away from using it as a category, it's really hard. It keeps coming back. The word nature basically suggests that there are two domains. There's the domain of humans and human works, and then there's the domain of everything else. So we're all intertangled with each other. We are influencing ecosystems, and those ecosystems are influencing us. Every player in all of these ecosystems is influencing one another. Now, humans are incredibly disruptive in many ecosystems. There is an ecological term called disturbance, which is this idea that things are going along and then a disturbance comes in and it really shakes things up and the ecology might shift. And sometimes a disturbance could be like a volcanic eruption, or it could be a landslide, it could be a fire. But humans can also be a disturbance. So could a beaver building a dam and flooding out a valley. So could a bark beetle showing up and decimating a forest. We are not the only species that can act like a disturbance agent. So this idea that there's only two kinds of places in the world, there's nature and there's not nature, is just an oversimplification that I think really limits our ability to think in a more nuanced way about this complex ecological world that we inhabit. I do think that it has a lot of baggage, and like a lot of abstract terms, a lot of the assumptions that it makes are kind of tucked inside of it. So that if you just say, oh, I like nature or I like going out in nature, you may not be thinking about all of these complex ramifications, but they're in there. They're kind of tucked inside.
Why do you think wildness is so important to us? And why, in our relationships with wildness, it has not always worked out well for wildness, such as zoos and national parks?
So let's talk about wildness. as a property that would pertain to an individual, animal or plant. This is a concept that I think does contain something useful. If we say that there's a wild animal, it could mean a lot of things. It could mean that it's not domesticated, or it could mean that it's not controlled. Like we might talk about wild horses. We might also see it as anything that is not a domesticated species. Looking at zoos is a way to probe how we feel about this. Is an animal that's in a zoo a wild animal? I think that some people might say, oh yeah, an elephant is wild or tiger is wild, but they're in this cage and they are being completely controlled by humans. And so they don't have a lot of autonomy. And that's really where I think we can use the word wild in a useful way, which is to describe the autonomy, the sort of freedom of individuals. Does an animal have the freedom to go where it wants to go? And does it have the freedom to make its own choices about what to do during the day and what to eat and how to behave? I do think that this is something that is valuable. It's valuable to these individual animals. They want it. I have a whole section in the book where I talk about animals trying to escape from zoos, which suggests that they value their freedom. They want out. So I think that is something that's ethically, morally valuable. And in that sense, I think the wildness of animals is something that we should care about. Your question also sort of asks, why do we care about wildness and wilderness and those things? And I think part of that is we're groping towards what I think is a very reasonable desire, which is to be less domineering on the landscape and to be more humble and to not be destructive. The way that we've approached that in sort of classical Western environmentalism is to say humans are bad for nature and we need to get humans out of nature. And I think an emerging alternative to that framing is to say humans are part of nature and we need to behave better. That's a different approach that's less about making things more wild in terms of removing humans, but it can definitely be about preserving the ability of non-humans to have freedom and make their own choices.
In the book, you talk about the California condor and selective breeding. What has the survival of the condor shown us about the complexities of saving wildlife and our values towards them?
So I chose the condor because I wanted to explore captive breeding for conservation. I said earlier that we do kill a lot of animals as part of conservation actions, and that's a real tension there. But I think there's also a tension when it comes to scooping up animals from their homes and putting them in cages and deciding who breeds with who as part of an effort to save their kind. I chose the condor case study because I feel like it is the strongest argument for this practice, because I think the evidence is pretty strong that it was successful. So the California condors are a magnificent, very large scavenging bird that was all around the West, and in the more recent past had declined to just a few dozens of individuals. In the 1980s, the decision was made to take all wild California condors into captivity and to breed them to keep them from going extinct. And this was quite controversial at the time. There were many environmentalists who felt that the sort of autonomy and wildness of the birds was more important than the continuation of their species and felt that this was not a good choice. But in the end, the program was able to help the reproduction of a lot of California condor chicks, and many, many birds were able to be released. I should say, this includes some of the original birds that were captured. These birds, which are quite long-lived, spent, in some cases, decades in captivity, but then were able to be let out again. You know, they are still quite heavily monitored. They have trackers. We're still taking care of them in a kind of a way. But I think, on balance, having talked to a lot of people who worked with these birds and explored the history, it seems like we saved their lives at the cost of their freedom. And then we did work hard to get them back out as soon as we could. So I think that you can really justify it. I don't think that necessarily means you can justify any conservation breeding program. You could imagine cases where there's no good exit strategy for these programs. Animals are being bred generation after generation in captivity without a clear plan for how to get them back out on the land. So many generations are sort of prisoner. We have to really look at the ethics of this. I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer for what we should do when it comes to conflicts between individuals and species. It's always going to be case by case. I'm not here to be the animal environment ethics judge. I'm just here to frame these questions and point out the complexities.
So can you talk about some of the issues and the problems that are unique to islands and invasive species?
Islands are so fascinating because you do have these compressed and dramatic ecological ripple effects of changes, of disturbance on islands because of their small size. On a larger continent, if a new species arrives, it might have quite dramatic effects in a local area. And there's also time for all of the players in these interactions to adapt. So on continents, there's often the ability, the capacity for adaptation to kind of absorb new players into the system without extinctions. But on islands, you run out of space. A new predator comes to the island and it starts eating some plant or animal that's native to that island. And that native plant or animal, there's not enough room for them to escape, for them to adapt to that new threat before they go extinct. So if you look at the data about where invasive species are causing extinctions, it's islands. It's almost always on islands. That's where this plays out. So in order to research extreme measures we might consider enacting to stop those extinctions from happening, I went to a lot of islands. In the book, I go to the Galapagos Islands, and I go to New Zealand, and I go to Australia, which, although it's really big, it acts like an island in terms of this dynamic. There are a lot of Australian native species that are really struggling to cope with cats and foxes.
Also in the book, you say, quote, "I think that ethical treatment of the non-human world likely depends on the ability of historically oppressed people, including people of color and indigenous people, to wield power and bring their values and ways of relating to the world to the conversation on equal terms with the old white guys who currently dominate that conversation." Are we beginning to have those conversations? And what might they sound like?
I think we are, and I'm excited to see this development. And before I proceed, I do want to take a moment to shout out and give my thanks to the old white guys of conservation who did a lot to draw attention to biodiversity crisis. Western environmentalism, I'm a critic of some of its core framing of humans and their place in the ecologies of the world. But I really do want to make it clear that I'm really grateful that generations of people who loved the natural world have worked hard to preserve it. And we are benefiting today from that work and from that care. So having said that, I do think that that kind of nature-human dualism thinking that was really core to that 1970s-based environmental conservation movement is holding us back. And it is making it difficult for us to move forward. So let me give you an example. If you've got an area that you want to protect, the notion of protection might mean it has to look the way it did before white people got here, back when Lewis and Clark first came through. And that's the sort of correct state for this forest or this prairie. You might work really hard to keep it in that state. And over time, this ecology that you're trying to freeze in amber, it might eventually make it more fragile. What you might get into is a pattern of stopping landscapes from adapting. And that's the danger of that kind of human nature dualism thinking on the ground, pragmatically speaking. So that's why I say that bringing in these other perspectives can often be much more flexible, can often be less sort of doctrinaire about which species belong or don't belong, can often involve much more human action on the landscape as an acceptable part of a solution. I think those all need to be in the mix as tools and options for us going forward. And I also believe in a fundamental justice of having all of the people who care about a place or have historical ties to a place at the table when making these decisions. People who studied ecology and have a lot of scientific expertise have a lot to bring to these conversations and to these decisions. They have a sophisticated understanding about how some of this stuff works, but they don't have all of the information. Some of it is also in traditional stories, traditional understandings. And I don't think that they have the moral right to say, no, science says that this plant doesn't belong here, or the science says we need to kill this animal. The science doesn't say what we should do. It never says what we should do. It only tells us what is and what might be depending on how we act. It can't tell us what we ought to do. To find out what we ought to do, we need everybody at the table.
So can you explain compassionate conservation and the controversies that surround it?
Compassionate conservation is a really interesting movement that's relatively recent, that I think is a response to the increase in killing as a conservation tool. And it really questions the use of that tool. Some compassionate conservationists, I think, say that it could be acceptable in some circumstances, but we need to really explore our options and ask hard questions before we reach for the gun or for the poison. And there are other compassionate conservationists who basically feel like all lethal action is just too arrogant and that we shouldn't be killing any animals. There's a spectrum there, but the common thread is that animal suffering, animal pain, animal rights, animal welfare, that these should matter in conversations about conservation and saving species. It's opened up a big conversation. There's been lots of papers back and forth, lots of discussion. I think it's been healthy for the field in general to have someone say, hey, before you make that action plan and buy all that rat poison, you should have these conversations.
So to use your own words, are species valuable? And how do we determine their value?
Yeah, this is the hardest chapter for me to write in the whole book. I have a chapter where I explore animal ethics, the difference between animal rights and animal welfare, feminist, kind of relational ethics, and lots of different approaches that are out there, really interesting stuff. And then I had to write the chapter about environmental ethics, specifically on the central question of whether a species, separate from the individuals that make it up, is something of value that we should really work hard to save and that we should even potentially kill to save. Take, for example, the northern white rhino, which has only female rhinos left, and they're elderly. So someday, the last northern white rhino is going to die of old age peacefully in its sleep, let's say. Now, from an animal welfare point of view, that doesn't seem that bad. That individual had lived a full life and it was well cared for, and now its life is coming to a close, and that's fine. But from an environmental ethics point of view, we have a moment of moral tragedy because we've lost a species. It's this idea that a group has value. The philosophy behind justifying this is more complicated because species can't feel pain. Species are kind of abstract collections. So there's lots of ways to get at it, but ultimately it's trickier, honestly, than saying, hey, it's not okay to hurt an animal. I found it really tough to write because I am a huge biodiversity worshiper in my personal life. I really, really think extinctions are bad at a very gut level. And the idea that it was tricky to kind of prove that was challenging for me, to say the least. I don't back down. I do think it is bad when there's extinctions for lots of reasons. Because it is an act of hubris and arrogance for us to cause that. And because I do believe that diversity, complexity, and the flow of energy between different organisms in an ecosystem is intrinsically valuable in some kind of way that you might have to describe as at least semi-spiritual.
So when it comes to wildness, are there any truly wild animals left?
If you're defining wildness as not being influenced by humans, no, there are no wild animals left. They all live in this world that has been very thoroughly humanized, that we have turned up the temperature, we've changed the atmospheric concentration, we've poked a hole in the ozone layer, and we've shuffled all the species around. Absolutely not. There's no animal that's living in some sort of pristine world. It's not happening. But if you define wild as it wakes up in the morning and it decides what it gets to have for breakfast, then the world is filled with wild animals. And in fact, some of them are in the city. Some of them are the rats of New York City running around having their own free time. We can't even control these rats if we tried. And we have tried. They are wild and free in a way that we are not even capable of restraining. So I think we need to define wildness for animals as individual autonomy, not as some sort of metaphysical state of being free from any taint of human influence.
And lastly, after finishing your journey and writing Wild Souls, in your estimation, what do you think we owe to the non-human species that we share this planet with?
Yes, this is a big question. What do we owe all of our other cousins out here? First of all, we owe them space. I do think that the traditional focus on protected areas makes a lot of sense for a lot of species. And so having a good, solid network of protected areas that are well connected by corridors so that animals can move around is key. I also think that we owe them good relationship insofar as we know how to do that. And this is something that I think many of us in this Western capitalistic mode have a long journey ahead of us in terms of discovering how to be, as Aldo Leopold said all those years ago, a good citizen of the ecological community rather than its dictator. Learning how to live well with other species is the key here. We cannot extract ourselves from the earth. We live here. We are ecological. We eat, we breathe, we walk, we have houses. We can do all of that in a way that is respectful of the others. That doesn't mean that we have no impact. That's impossible. By nature, there is always going to be suffering and death in the world. That's something that I talk a lot about in the book. It's really tricky to wrap your mind around it because there is no version of an Earth that's both diverse and free of pain and suffering, because food webs and food chains are built on death and suffering. But what the journey ahead of us entails is figuring out how to live in that web, how to be part of that web without just ripping it to shreds every time we try to do anything. And that is the way forward. It's all about relationality. It's all about mutually beneficial, sustainable relationships with other species and respecting their autonomy as creatures with goals, desires, an understanding of the world that's quite different from our own.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Emma Marris, talking about what we owe animals in this changing world. And I hope you take the opportunity to read her latest book, Wild Souls, as well as her first book, Rambunctious Garden. Also, I hope you visit her website, emmamarris.com, to read the host of articles that Emma has written. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.